And this is what I played for him.
Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Cuckoo Town podcast. I'm Mark, your host. Today's episode is Weird Woods and Higher Space. I grew up in southeast England during the 1960s and 70s. I lived alongside the River Tillingbourne amidst the rolling Surrey hills. Just across that small river and a field was a copse, a wood. It wasn't that big, but despite that it still managed to instill in me a sense of mystery. During the spring and summer months, the countryside behind us, including the ancient Chantry's woodlands, which were a 20-minute walk away behind that smaller wood, was our playground. I liked to get in that smaller woodland and just wander around on my own, enjoying the solitude and the nature all around me. But on one occasion there had been an unexpected, sudden, creepy silence. The wildlife had gone quiet as if by some telepathic communal command. I had felt eyes on me. There was something in that wood that commanded respect from the animals, but had previously been making a beautiful noise. I couldn't see anything, but knew that whatever it was could see me. This was rural England. We didn't have any known cryptids roaming about our countryside, not that we'd ever heard of anyway, except for the legendary Surrey puma, but this didn't feel like a flesh and blood creature that was stalking me. It was one of my first encounters with what I'd later call the other. I don't think it was a physical threat to me. Well, I'm still here, aren't I? I think that whatever it was just as curious about me as I was about it. Anyway, it was all over and done with really quickly, and the natural woodland noises had resumed all at once, as if a switch had been flicked back to the on position. During the winter, with much shorter days, I didn't get over the stream, as we referred to that area behind our home, quite so much. The river would be deeper, and the fields approaching the wood a lot muddier. Once Guy Fawkes night, bonfire night, was over, the long dark winter nights would arrive with a vengeance, keeping me, in those days long before I was old enough to go for a beer with my mates, stuck inside our tiny house most evenings. This was when I would do most of my reading. I liked to curl up in an armchair close to one of my dad's blazing log fires. It was the only heat source for us in those days. The radiator central heating was still a few years off in our place. Other people had it, I should point out. It's just that we were a little bit behind on that score. If you wanted to keep warm, you just put another sweater on or perhaps a woolly hat and a scarf. One of my go-to reads in those days was an old hardback book in one of my dad's many bookcases in the sitting room. It was a collection of short horror-ghost stories by Algernon Blackwood. It was entitled Tales of the Uncanny and Supernatural, and it's still a favourite of mine many decades later. Many of Algernon Blackwood's eerie short stories, such as Ancient Lights, The Man Whom the Trees Loved, The Willows, they all centred around the idea that trees were conscious beings and that they would, if necessary, use violence against us humans if we threatened them in any way. Blackwood's ideas about their social nature, that they communicated with each other, were well ahead of a scientist discovering it. And by extension, we can also hypothesise that they fit into James Lovelock's later, 1972, Gaian concept. Blackwood liked to combine his fascination with woodlands with Charles Howard Hinton's concept of higher space, other unseen dimensions around us. For example, in his A Victim of Higher Space, plus a fascinating short story that I'm going to read to you a little later. It's called Entrance and Exit. Charles Howard Hinton published his ideas on higher space of a theoretical fourth dimension, and possibly more, all around us back in the late 1880s. Hinton was one of Blackwood's major inspirations, but he had, in turn, been inspired by those who went before him, great thinkers like Gauss, Kant and Lobachevsky. And you should also bear in mind that these mathematicians, geometers, philosophers were already positing these ideas about other dimensions around us many decades before the two guys who usually get all the credit on modern paranormal podcasts. I'm talking about John Keel and Jacques Vale. This is an evolving hypothesis. It's been a team effort over many, many years. If you haven't yet read Entrance and Exit, you are in for a brain-stimulating treat. You will, I'm sure, pick up on all the similarities to situations and events, paranormal events, that we read about or hear about on our modern paranormal podcasts. I won't say what those correlations are until after you've heard it. I will say that Entrance and Exit, and many other weird fictions too, not just by Blackwood, but by other people too, people like M.R. James, Abraham Merritt and Arthur Machen, are not solely based on these theoretical ideas. They were, and are, already out there in our collective consciousness. People have had these experiences for real, whatever real might mean. In some cases, I'm sure, people's experiences have spread by word of mouth and media, and then they've been picked up by these creative writers and adapted. One feeds the other. There are so many correlations between fact and fiction. They are, as I said in one of my Spirit of Cornwall books, complementary verses of the same song. Entrance and Exit by Elgin and Blackwood. These three, the old physicist, the girl, and the young Anglican parson who was engaged to her, stood by the window of the country house. The blinds were not yet drawn. They could see the dark clump of pines in the field, with crests silhouetted against the pale wintry sky of a February afternoon. Snow, freshly fallen, lay upon lawn and hill. A big moon was already lighting up. "Yes, that's the wood," the old man said, "and it was this very day 50 years ago, February 13th, but the man disappeared from its shadows, swept in this extraordinary, incredible fashion into invisibility, into some other place. Can you wonder the grove is haunted?" A strange impressiveness of manner belied the laugh that followed his words. "Oh, please tell us," the girl whispered. "We're all alone now." Curiosity triumphed, yet a vague alarm betrayed itself in the questioning glance that she cast for protection at her younger companion, whose fine face, on the other hand, wore an expression that was grave and singularly rapt. He was listening keenly. As though nature, the physicist went on, half to himself, here and there concealed vacuums, gaps, holes in space. His mind was always speculative, more than speculative, some said. In fact, at right angles to three known ones. Higher space, through which a man might drop invisibly, a new direction, as Boyle, Gauss and Hinton might call it, and what you, with your mystical turn, he looked toward the young priest, might consider a spiritual change of condition, into a region where space and time do not exist, and where all dimensions are possible because they are one. "But please, the story," the girl begged, not understanding these dark sayings. "Although I'm not sure that Arthur ought to hear it. He's much too interested in such queer things as it is." Smiling yet uneasy, she stood closer to his side, as though her body might protect his soul. "Very briefly, then, you shall hear what I remember of this haunting, for I was barely 10 years old at the time. It was evening, clear and cold like this, with snow and moonlight, when someone reported to my father that a peculiar sound, variously described as crying, wailing, was being heard in the grove. He paid no attention until my sister heard it too, and was frightened. Then he sent a groom to investigate. Though the night was brilliant, the man took a lantern. We watched from this very window till we lost his figure against the trees, and the lantern stopped swinging suddenly, as if he had put it down. It just remained motionless. We waited half an hour, and then my father, curiously excited, I remember, went out quickly, and I, utterly terrified, went after him. We followed his tracks, which came to an end beside the lantern, the last step being a stride almost impossible for a man to have made. All around the snow was unbroken by a single mark, but the man himself had vanished. Then we heard him calling for help, above, behind, beyond us, from all directions at once, yet from none came the sound of his voice. But though we called back, he made no answer, and gradually his cries grew fainter and fainter, as if going into tremendous distance, and at last died away altogether. "And the man himself?" asked both listeners. "Never returned. From that day to this had never been seen. At intervals for weeks and months afterwards, reports came in that he was still heard crying, always crying for help. With time, even these reports ceased, for most of us," he added under his breath, "and that is all I know, in mere outline, as you see." The girl did not quite like the story, for the old man's manner made it all too convincing. She was half disappointed, half frightened. "See, there are others coming home," she exclaimed with a note of relief, pointing to a group of figures moving over the snow near the pine trees. "Now we can think of tea." She crossed the room to busy herself with a friendly tray as the servant approached to fasten the shutters. The young priest, however, deeply interested, talked on with their host, though in a voice almost too low for her to hear. Only the final sentences reached her, making her uneasy, absurdly so, she thought, till afterwards. For matter, as we know, interpenetrates matter, she heard, and two objects may conceivably occupy the same space. The odd thing really is that one should hear but not see, that airwaves should bring a voice, yet ether waves fail to bring a picture. Then the older man. As if certain places in nature, yes, invited the change, places where these extraordinary forces stir from the earth as from the surface of a living being with organs. Places like islands, mountain tops, pine woods, especially pines isolated from their kind. You know the queer results of digging absolutely virgin soil, of course, and that theory of the earth being alive. The voice dropped again. States of mind also helping the forces of a place. She caught the priest's reply in part. Such as conditions induced by music, by intense listening, by certain moments in the mass even, by ecstasy or... "I say, what do you think?" cried a girl's voice, as the others came in with welcome chatter and odours of tweeds and open fields. "As we passed your old haunted pine wood, we heard such a queer noise, like someone wailing or crying." Caesar howled and ran, and Harry refused to go in and investigate. He positively funked it. They laughed at Harry. "More like a rabbit into a trap than a person crying," said Harry, a blush kindly concealing his startling pallor. "I wanted my tea too much to bother about an old rabbit." It was some time after tea when the girl became aware that the priest had disappeared, and putting two and two together ran in alarm to her host's study. Quite easily from the hastily opened shutters they saw his figure moving across the snow. The moon was very bright over the world, yet he carried a lantern that shone pale yellow against the white brilliance. "Oh, for God's sake, quick!" she cried, pale with fear now. "Quick, or we're too late. Arthur's simply wild about such things. Oh, I might have known, I might have guessed, and this is the very night." By the time he had found his overcoat and slipped around the house with her from the back door, the lantern, they saw, was already swinging close to that pine wood. The night was still as ice, bitterly cold. Breathlessly they ran, following the tracks. Halfway his steps diverged and were plainly visible in the virgin snow by themselves. They heard the whispering of the branches ahead of them, for pines cry even when no airs stir. "Follow me close," said the old man sternly. The lantern, he already saw, lay upon the ground unattended. No human figure was anywhere visible. "See? The steps come to an end here," he whispered, stooping down as soon as they reached the lantern. The tracks, hitherto so regular, showed an odd wavering, the snow curiously disturbed. Quite suddenly they had stopped. The final step was a very long one, a stride almost immense, as though he was pushed forward from behind, said the old man, too low to be overheard, or sucked forward from in front, as if in a fall. The girl would have dashed forward but for his strong restraining grasp. She clutched him, uttering a sudden dreadful cry. "Hark, I hear his voice," she sobbed. They stood still to listen. A mystery that was more than the mystery of night closed about their hearts, a mystery that is beyond life and death, that only great awe and terror can summon from the deeps of the soul. Out of the heart of the trees 50 feet away issued a crying voice, half wailing, half singing, very faint. "Help, help!" it sounded through the still night. "For the love of God, pray for me!" The melancholy rustling of the pines followed, and then again the singular crying voice shot past above their heads, now in front of them, now once more behind them. It sounded everywhere. It grew fainter and fainter, fading away, it seemed, into distance that was somehow appalling. The grove, however, was empty of all but the sighing wind, the snow unbroken by any tread. The moon threw inky shadows, the cold bit. It was a terror of ice and death and this awful singing cry. "But why pray?" screamed the girl, distracted, frantic with her bewildered terror. "Why pray? Let us do something to help. Do something." She swung around in a circle, nearly falling to the ground. Suddenly she perceived that the old man had dropped to his knees in the snow beside her, and he was praying. Because the forces of prayer, of thought, of the will to help alone can reach and succour him where he now is, was all the answer she got. And a moment later both figures were kneeling in the snow, praying, so to speak, their very heart's life out. The search may be imagined, the steps taken by the police, friends, newspapers, by the whole country in fact, but the most curious part of this queer higher space adventure is the end of it, at least the end so far as at present known. For after 3 weeks, when the winds of March were a roar about the land, there crept over the fields towards the house the small dark figure of a man. He was thin, pallid as a ghost, worn and fearfully emaciated, but upon his face and in his eyes were traces of an astonishing radiance, a glory unlike anything ever seen. It may, of course, have been deliberate, or it may have been a genuine loss of memory only. None could say, least of all the girl whom his return snatched from the gates of death. But at any rate, what had come to pass during the interval of his amazing disappearance, he has never yet been able to reveal. And you must never ask me, he would say to her, and repeat even after his complete and speedy restoration to bodily health, for I simply cannot tell. I know no language, you see, that could possibly express it. I was near you all the time, but I was also elsewhere and otherwise. OK, that was Entrance and Exit by Elgin and Blackwood. I hope you enjoyed it. There were a few things there which I'm sure you picked up on, similarities of sort of the fairy folklore when people were abducted and they sort of got put back in the same place and they didn't know where they'd been, or they didn't know how long they'd been away. It was all based on the ideas of Hinton, Boyle, Gales, Hinton. But there were sort of a few other sort of weird things as well. I mean, like, there's one thing I've just only recently picked up on where it says we're having this discussion where the two guys, the vicar and the old physicist, are having this discussion about where these odd things happen or tend to happen. And he says, the queer results of digging absolutely virgin soil, of course. And that theory of the Earth being alive. Well, the Earth being alive thing is not new to us, really. We've got the Gaian hypothesis, obviously. But the idea of digging absolutely virgin soil and it has some effect, that didn't really strike me till recently, because I was watching a documentary about Skinwalker Ranch where they had told this guy, whatever you do, don't dig over there, don't work the soil, because strange things happen, And the guy did, and he ended up with like a really nasty swollen head. And I just wondered if there was some link there. I mean, it's just a weird link, but because I've never heard of that before, other than that story, Other than that, I think it's just fairly straightforward. I mean, obviously there's a correlation there with David Paulides' Missing 411 stories. It's just one of Blackwood's great stories where he combines the idea of the trees being conscious beings and these ideas of other dimensions around us. If you haven't read any Elgin and Blackwood, I would highly recommend it. Also Arthur Machen, Abraham Merritt's another good one, and you'll find this sort of stuff does, it matches this modern paranormal stuff that we hear about, read about, watch on TV and so on. Basically what I'm saying, this stuff's been around forever, and as I said in my earlier piece, we're always giving John Keel and Jacques Vale, I say Vale because I found out that's the way you're supposed to say it, not Valley. That's Frankie Valli in the Four Seasons, but it's Jacques Vale. So they always get the credit, I think, for bringing in these ideas. And they did great work, obviously, but they weren't the first. This stuff's been around a long time, and I think the important thing I'm trying to get over is the relationship between so-called fiction, the weird fiction, and fact, or alleged fact. It's coming from the same place. See you next time when we'll take another stroll down a road less travelled. Be lucky.
Be lucky.
Pretty bird, she warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack of diamonds,
In the heat of the investigative pursuit, the shortest distance between 2 points is not necessarily a straight line.